think of, obviously when you say radical design, I tend to think of politically driven design, or design that's about causes or issues, or is a bit more controversial, a bit more edgy.
Yeah. There's a problem that people confuse radical with kind of making a mess, which isn't radical. It's the real radical typography deals with the structure of letter forms and trying to approach those in a different way, or the structure of language and expression of language. That is what typography does.
Yeah.
Most of the experiments that designers do, they do when they're students. And I think most of them were on the fringes of the study of graphic design, because the study of graphic design as it then was a serious attempt to see how we could take over the process of type specification and turn it into something creative.
I think a radical piece, from the titles for that film, Anatomy of a Murder, with a kind of cut-up figure in black outline.
Yeah.
Which would have owed a lot to the Bauhaus and graphic design.
Well, I suppose the Bauhaus was the most radical one in the 80s and 90s, but I think the most radical influence at the moment is money, isn't it? I don't know.
I would look more to the work of people like Robbie Conall, who, sort of basically puts his money where his mouth is. So not only is he producing fly posters about, politics in America and social issues in America, but actually has teams of people running around the city pasting them up, and which is actually an illegal activity.
So if there is a radical aesthetic, but the radical aesthetic has to come from philosophy first.
Yeah.
And honestly, I don't think in typography there's been anything radical for quite a long time. The last two things were postmodernism, deconstruction. I haven't really seen anything else. There was a return to modernism, but it wasn't radical.
Paul Klee stuff like taking a line for a walk. When does a line become a shape? How thick does it have to be? But they were all the kind of basic tenets of. I mean, there's much more to it than that, but it was all rooted in Bauhaus teaching.
1968, the student May revolts in Paris. The work of the students at the École des Beaux-Arts at that time is absolutely stunning. Of course, they had great exemplars to draw on. Their work wasn't entirely original, but in the context of the time and the way in which they worked, those collection of maybe 20, 30 hastily drawn, knocked out posters is totally wonderful. I show them often to students who've never seen them before. They are overwhelmed. They say, well, how did that happen? I say, well, it happened because a bunch of students had a very strong political point to make, and they said the best way of making it is with our skills. And we have skills in drawing them, we'll draw them up. And they drew them, just like that. And they bung the posters up. And I hold them as a brilliant example, which should be shown again to each generation of students. They are true exemplar of radical design method.
Those sit-ins at Hornsey and other places were sparked really by the Paris riots, by student upheaval there. And I think art schools were the place where such fermentation would take place, because they tended to be a little bit more eccentric and a little bit more bohemian than, I don't know, mathematics students or something.
To me, the most radical stuff was done at the beginning of the 20th century, and it hasn't really been bettered. Sorry to say that, but it's when the constructivists worked, and there was new visual language needed for a new political ideology, and just sort of surged forward in terms of inventiveness, and also the crossover between artists and designers.
Well, I think the view of many traditionalists in art schools at the time was that the Bauhaus and basic design messed up British art education, because pretty soon, I can't remember what date exactly, but a bit later in the 60s, the Coldstream Report, which was brought in after a huge inspection of every art school in Britain, and how they were doing and what they needed to do.
Right.
And this was presented to Parliament, and art schools were instructed to kind of get their act together in certain ways.
Right.
There was a very laissez-faire attitude to how art should and was being taught. You know, everything was based upon the past, really, what had worked in the past, and a very traditional approach, certainly strong on representational art.
Yes, Victoria.
And I think throughout Britain, really, among art schools and collectors and people in the Arts Council, there was a resistance to the modern movements, you know, to surrealism, cubism, expressionism, metaphysical painting, and certainly to the big movement of the time, the New York School. You know, that kind of abstract expressionism was something that was thought to be very un-English, you know, and not to be subscribed to, but eventually it filtered in and kind of took over in a way.
Colleges seem to be moving more and more towards an American education system where it's much more of concern about the amount of money per student that's brought in.
Students,
and the class sizes are ridiculous nowadays. So
Okay.
I feel sorry for most of the students who are learning today compared to when there was only, like, when I was at Rook, I was only 15 in the class.
Right.
So, and if you wanted to talk to a tutor, you could. I mean, I ignored them most of the time anyway, but at least the option was there. So
absolutely.
And at St Martin there was 60 in the year, and now I think it's well beyond that, well over 100, 180, something like that.
Right. Yeah.
So I think the problem is one-to-one teaching now. But also there's there's a lack of tutorial, but there is a lack of instruction now. I've noticed it's sort of going further and further away. A lack of interest in craft, definitely. Of actually, it's not the one-to-one teaching, but actually getting students to sit down and do an exercise.
Yeah,
or
do a
something.
process, as it were.
It's almost impossible. First, because they feel like they would be bored, and secondly, there just probably isn't the time to do it. Often with the amount of students. So.
I want those too many perhaps, young people doing graphic design to be told, and in a way reassured, that we will give them the basic skills. I'm still talking about that, and I'm talking about it because I see, to my deep regret, students emerging after 3 or 4 years in graphic design courses without the skills they need. For example, typography. How can any graphic designer emerge who is not properly inducted into typographic standards, norms, procedures? And yet it happens. It stinks.
Well, I think there should be an understanding of the critical context of graphic design, of knowing where design is placed in the visual arts, about the role it has, because obviously it's different from fine art, and the way it's viewed by people is seen as a service rather than a creative discipline. And also its relationship to philosophy, contemporary philosophy, and the need to read as well to help that influence, and how people aspire to certain kind of clients, but certain jobs.
Right.
I mean, I still see in design colleges where I go, there's an emphasis on getting a job at the end, which I think is utterly boring, because it's more important to develop the person and create interesting designers than create portfolios that get people jobs.
Not just feeding an industry and what an industry says it wants. Because I think if you go out and find out what an industry says it wants people with, Photoshop skills, or it needs people, do you know what I mean, it needs Mac monkeys. But that's not what we're about to kind of produce.
Right.
So it's trying to kind of make people employable, but in the same way try and push the industry forward a little bit, because our students are the future of the industry. And I think certainly in an area like advertising, I think it's quite interesting that I've got students who are now going and working in areas of experiential design, or in kind of, online advertising, or kind of areas that you couldn't really have predicted a few years ago. And I think it's important that we try and kind of keep up with that and maybe push trends rather than just feed the industry with what
Yes, yeah,
it perceives it wants. I think it's where students start demonstrating independent thinking, which is the big difference, I think, from school level education. So I think schools that do it well are in a minority, and I think foundation courses that do it well are probably, you know, slightly more in the majority.
Yeah.
So we do like taking students from foundation because we do find they have a better range of experience and they're more willing to embrace experimentation and independent thought, really.
A foundation course is what it ought to be. A wide-ranging course which allows a student and encourages a student, not just allows but encourages a student to look at all the possibilities in art and design before she or he makes their minds up.
Yeah.
If that is under threat, then I deeply regret it. If in fact people are expected to make their minds up exactly what vocation they should want to do when they're 18 years old, I think it's a pity. And most of all, we shouldn't be slotted into a vocational avenue from which it seems we can't diverge or have another view. I want everyone to be capable of making her or his own moral judgments, not to have to be a slave to other people's decisions about what they should or shouldn't take up as a moral position.
And they were rooted in Bauhaus teaching.
Yeah.
You know, the Bauhaus plan, the central workshop, and all these
Different.
activities radiating from it. And it meant that anyone from any area could dip into the central pool of activity, so that during the duration of the foundation course, or whatever they called it in the Bauhaus, students were able to discover where their abilities lay. I mean, that was the whole point, you know, that it would give them experiences of various different activities, and eventually they would say, you know, I want to be a textile designer, you know, I want to be a graphic designer, or I want to do furniture design, or I want to do fine art.
Well, I didn't really know what I wanted to do, even though I finished my degree course, so I think specialising very, very early on is problematic. The idea of a foundation where you move across disciplines, I think is really a really great thing for students to do. And I definitely think that should be kept. I mean, this move towards vocationalism, I think, is not the right way to do it.
No.
I think so. Yes, I'm all up for foundation courses being kept.
On the 20th